hand over the microphone, the screen, to Melissa Wijngaard. She's going to be presenting on toxic stress and trauma, what we can expect to see in classrooms. As we did in the previous presentation, we encourage you to use the chat box feature and the question and answer discussion board, as myself and several other colleagues will be monitoring those and guiding questions as the presentation goes on.
Thank you, Annabelle. Good morning, good afternoon, I guess we're almost at. My name is Melissa Wijngaard, and I have been practicing infant and early childhood mental health for over 15 years. I am currently the clinical director of the Child First program with Families First of Palm Beach County. We run an in-home intervention where we work with children 0 to 5 and their caregivers. I have teams of care coordinators and therapists who practice child-parent psychotherapy. Traditionally, we go out into the home and provide therapy, early intervention, and case management services to those in need in Palm Beach County. With the pandemic, we also have had to make the switch to virtual services. So we are providing therapy and early intervention services and case management through Zoom, through WhatsApp, through FaceTime, through any kind of application that we can use to reach the families. I think it's an important time to talk about toxic stress and trauma, and I've been asked to come here today to speak about how trauma and toxic stress affect young children, the youngest, from 0 to 5, and their families. When we think about the children who have been quarantined at home with their families, who are living in these kinds of environments, it is really important for us to take some time and to learn about how this might be affecting their brain development, their readiness to learn, their behavior, so we can kind of make some reflections and think about what we might be expecting when we do return to a classroom setting, and give out some resources for teachers and for early interventionists, places that you can go to get some practical help when working with children who may have been not doing so well during this pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My thought for the morning is that we try to make it through the slides and maybe ask questions right now just for clarification, and then I can leave some time at the end to answer questions since we do only have an hour and a pretty heavy topic to get through. So in order for me to talk to you about the effects of trauma and stress, we need to kind of go back and begin talking about healthy attachment relationships so we can reflect. I think we can all agree and we all know that we need healthy attachment relationships for survival. A baby cannot exist without a caregiver. That goes for our physical needs, our emotional needs, our developmental needs, and our growth. The reciprocal emotional and physical relationship that we have with our caregivers sets the stage for all future intimate and trusting relationships. Attachment bonds protect the young child from fear and from threat. It is through nurturing, protective, stable, and consistent relationships that we develop our sense of self-esteem. This is how babies learn they are worthy of care, and this carries over into adulthood. It's a message that you receive that you can do something, that you can make it, that you can succeed, and if you don't, you have support to try again. This is why kids grow up to run for student council president and try out for sports teams, because there's a message inside that someone has taught them that they might be able to make it, they might be able to get it, and if they don't, it'll be okay, they'll make it through. So through these healthy attachment relationships, babies learn that caregivers will help them when they are upset. As a result of this, they learn to manage their feelings, and this is where they learn how to regulate. We're not born with the ability to regulate and manage our feelings. This organization is learned, and it happens through your caregiver relationship. So when a baby is upset and crying, and a parent or a teacher or a caregiver responds and verbalizes, you're hungry, you're scared, you need changing, we start to help them to differentiate their own needs and learn how to calm down and self-regulate. So I'm going to show a brief video clip that kind of summarizes this and talks a little bit about the attachment relationship, early care, and how it affects brain development.
The social womb. What is a social womb? And why does each human infant's brain need one? A social womb is a safe, healthy, and engaging environment where a very young child is provided the opportunity to develop secure bonds with people who care for them, engage in physical, social, intellectual, and communicative exploration, and build a positive self-identity and sense of others. Why does the brain of a human infant need a social womb? Because of the unique way humans continue to develop their brains throughout their lives, but particularly during the first 3 years. The human brain is adapting and developing more rapidly in infancy than at any subsequent period of life. As we all know, a healthy womb is critical to healthy brain growth because much of the essential construction of the human brain happens inside the womb. But there's so much more wiring and growth happening in the brain during infancy that it might be helpful to think of the newborn human brain as a preemie, which continues to need special womb-like nurturance for quite some period of time. When babies are born, their hearts, kidneys, and lungs are essentially just smaller versions of the ones they will have as adults. But their brains are different. Their brains are structurally unfinished. What takes place, especially during the first 3 years of life, is that their brains use the interactions, environments, and experiences in which they participate to continue to construct neurological pathways that prepare the brain for the thinking and feeling that lie ahead. Unlike most animals, whose physical ability and brain wiring allow them to function independently relatively soon after they're born, but limit their capacity for complex thought, the human baby remains dependent on adults for a much longer period of time. But rather than this dependence being a weakness, the brain uses it as a time for learning. During the first 3 years of life, the brain is being structured not only to help the infant survive, but help him or her to develop ways to fit in and function in society, make connections with people and places, and form the critical thinking and communication skills it will need for success in life. Be it at home or in childcare, what happens during infancy is too eventful to leave to chance. For the human brain to grow strong during its early development, it needs the special protection and enrichment of a strong social womb.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. And let's kind of think about some of the key points that came across in that video. In order for a brain to grow, for an infant's brain to grow, there are factors that need to be in place. And for it to grow to capacity, the infant and the young child needs to feel safe, needs health, to be healthy and have the right nutrition. Infants and toddlers need engaging environments that are consistent, predictable, and loving, whether that be at home or at school. The child, and we talked about self-esteem a minute ago, needs that positive self-identity and sense of others, a reinforcement that they are worthy of care, that they are loved and valued. And this is all related to that development of a secure attachment. So let's start to go into a little bit about stress and the body stress response. So we all experience stress. We have all been experiencing higher levels of stress since March than previously. And your body has a stress response when faced with stress, and it's called the fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'm sure everybody's heard of and is a little bit familiar with. Our brain does this without thinking. It's a biological phenomenon. It is designed to help us survive danger. It's where your brain is releasing these chemicals, and the signals have immediate and powerful effects throughout your entire body. So let's just say that I was about to be attacked by a bear. And my stress response is going to kick in because I'm out there and I'm facing extreme stress. My stress response is either going to help my body get ready to fight the bear, which doesn't sound like it probably work out so well for me, but that's what my body's going to do. It's going to get me ready to fight. It's going to get me ready to flight, run away as fast as I can, or it's going to get me ready to freeze, play dead, hide, stand still. So those are kind of the three biological processes that are going to go on in my body. It's going to be a fight, flight, or freeze. This is what's going on in my brain, and the rest of my body is also having a reaction. When I am faced with stress, I feel it all over. My heart is beating faster and it's pumping blood harder. My lungs, my breathing is getting more shallow because the supply of breath to my heart and my other muscles. My muscles are getting tight and tense, all of them. My stomach and intestines, I'm starting to feel it in there. Today I had some stress because I thought, oh, I have to present and I hope Zoom goes well and I hope I don't get kicked off and I hope my audio works, and you face some stress and you can't really eat very well, or you start to have butterflies in your stomach, or you start to get nauseous or feel like you're going to throw up. So this stress response is felt throughout our body, and it's very normal for all of us to experience stress. There's a normal amount of stress in our lives that we're used to when we face a traffic jam and we're late for something, when we're trying to use technology and we're not very good at it. But there's a difference when we talk about toxic stress. Toxic stress is when a child experiences strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity and there's no adequate protection. So this would be physical or emotional abuse. This would be chronic neglect. The people who are supposed to be taking care of you are not taking care of you or are harming you. There's caregiver substance abuse or mental illness, so there's unpredictability, inconsistency, not sure where our parents are sometimes. There's exposure to violence when there's fighting or any kind of violence in the home or neighborhood. That is toxic stress. There's also the accumulated burdens of economic hardship. Those families that have a real lack of resources, that parents are working all the time, that are not around, that there's not a consistent home, there's not consistent food, that we don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. This is all contributing to toxic stress for children. So I'm going to show another brief clip which talks a little bit about how toxic stress derails healthy child development.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, So I think that was a really good summary of toxic stress and how it affects brain development, and that that alarm system in the brain, where when you're operating on that fight, flight, or freeze, your brain is constantly in this alarm system. You are seeing the world through a lens of intense emotions like fear and anger. You know, you think about a child who wakes up in the morning after a full night's sleep and who is tucked in properly and got stories read to them at bedtime. And they wake up and the day is full of possibilities, and there's an excitement and a smile. And I see these kids coming into the classroom, and they're, you know, might be sad about leaving their parents, but there's a fascination and a readiness to learn and be with our friends. When you have experienced chronic trauma, toxic stress, it's a change in the way that you see the world. It's seeing the world as an unsafe place. New experiences might not be good. There's a lens of intense emotions like anger and fear, and your common reaction to something, whether it be just something new that you've not tried, something you haven't touched, an activity you haven't done, moving from one activity that transitions to another, is going to be met with a strong emotional reaction, because it seems like everyone and everything is out to get you. So this is seen in children as this real lack of emotional regulation, an inability to ease into new situations, an inability to self-regulate. So I'd like to kind of do something right now, and it really does kind of summarize a lot of the stuff we just talked about. And this is something that I keep in my mind all the time. And if you take anything from my presentation today, I hope this is something that you'll take with you and think about when you're in your classrooms or in your therapy rooms and you're working with kids. I would really like everyone to go ahead and take your hand and just put your hand in the air here. And if we could use 4 fingers and put your thumb right here. We're going to take a look and practice the hand model of the brain from Dr. Daniel Siegel. So let's take a look at your hand right here. And the wrist and your palm right here, this is the fight, flight, or freeze that I talked about. This is your brain's fight, flight, or freeze, your brain stem. This is responsible for survival. Your thumb right here, is where we store and integrate memories and hold fear. So the 4 fingers right here, this, I'd like you to kind of close them over your thumb right now. And this is our executive functioning. This is our thinking and our higher functioning right here. So if we look at our hand and we think about this like the brain, what I want you to think about is when a child who is in toxic stress and constantly under stress, this executive functioning, this thinking part of the brain, it is flipped. So when you and I encounter that bear, we've gone whoop, and we flipped our brain like this. The kids who are constantly facing adversity, whose homes are not safe, and who are always under stress, they're walking around like this. So we think about the kids coming into our classroom in the day, in the morning, and we've got this kid coming in who's, you know, had 8 hours of sleep last night and had a story read to him and woke up and had some smiles and had a nice breakfast and got dressed and took a nice ride to school. And they're coming into class like this. And then we think about this kid who maybe there was a lot of fighting and yelling last night in their home, and they went in their room to escape from it, and they didn't sleep very well. And they woke up and mommy wasn't there, and their brother took them to school and there was no breakfast. And these kids are going to walk into the classroom together like this. And should our reaction to these kids, if we give them the same reaction, we're not going to have the same kid, right? We're not going to get anywhere. And what's important for us, and what we're going to start to think about and talk about for the rest of the presentation, is kind of how to get these kids down like this. And trying to find a way, because even if this is what's happening outside of our classroom, if we can start to incorporate concepts and self-care and relaxation and self-regulation and nurturance into our classroom, and we can start to get these kids like this, then we can start to be more productive and we can help the learning. So I hope that's a helpful model and something that you can take with you, because I do it all the time when I'm working with kids and I'm looking at kids, and it comes right into my mind is, how do I get this kid to get like this? And that's, I can't teach colors and ABCs, and I can't teach anything until I get this. So let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about stress. We all know what stress is, but I want to talk about what trauma and toxic stress, because there's a little bit of a difference. A traumatic event is a scary, dangerous, violent event involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, threat to psychological integrity. That's either to the child, to a caregiver, to a family member. It's an overwhelming sense of terror and helplessness. A traumatic event is a very scary, big deal event. The physical effects lead to fight, flight, or freeze. The brain is flipped. Not every child that experiences a traumatic event is going to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's an important thing that I always talk to new clinicians about when I'm working them, because we think, oh, I have a child coming in and, you know, there was a car accident, or I have a child coming in and there was this, and they must have PTSD. Well, that's not true. You have to meet a certain criteria, and PTSD is a pretty serious thing. But every child who's experienced a traumatic event or witnessed one has been exposed to toxic stress. And toxic stress, as it layers, and the more of it you have, the more time you're spending like this. And the more time that you're exposed to triggers that can flip your lid, which we may not know what they are. So when we think about the videos we saw before, we think about all of the toxic stress going on and how this is always going to affect the brain development, the behavior, and the mood. So when looking at trauma, we can think about it about a couple things. We can think about acute trauma. Acute trauma is a single event that lasted for a limited time. It's one thing, maybe a car accident, a flood, a hurricane. Recovery is likely, especially if you have protective factors. So if I have a child and they were in a car accident and I am available to them and I can talk about it and how terrible it was and that they're safe now, and if they have nightmares about it, I can be there for them and talk them through it. And eventually, it's likely that recovery will happen with my nurturance and my availability. Complex trauma, on the other hand, is a very different situation. Complex trauma is often relational, and it begins early in life. It is severe, invasive, interpersonal. So complex trauma is when the person who is supposed to be protecting you and keeping you safe is the cause of your stress, is the cause of your problem. And that's why it's complex, because who do you go to for recovery? It impacts development, and it impacts the ability to form healthy attachments. It impacts the way a child treats people and looks at people and looks at the world. And it changes the child's brain quite literally. So what does this mean? Like, what do we do with all of this information? We're not, you know, if I'm a teacher and I'm in the classroom, or I'm doing early intervention services in the classroom or through the telehealth, I'm not going to be doing a full assessment to figure out everything this child's been through. I just can't do that. That's not part of my job. But I can kind of realize and think about the fact that behavior has meaning. So when we're seeing behaviors that are not typical of a small child, that we do need to stop and reflect and think that behavior has meaning. So exposure to a traumatic stress, children who are experiencing this, they're coming back to school, they've had all this time without the recovery period and that time where they get to leave the home, or even other people who might be causing the stress leave the home because everybody is stuck at home together. And we don't have breaks like playgrounds or things like that. So the more amount of time we're exposed to the stress, the higher the consequences. Children who are exposed to traumatic stress, we're going to see withdrawn, sad, difficult to engage. And that's not typical of a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old. Yeah, they have sad. Yeah, they have moments where they're upset, but they usually want comfort. They usually seek us out. So someone who really is avoidant of adult contact and doesn't participate in anything, that could be that freeze, fight, flight, or freeze. Aggressive behaviors with adults or peers, that's your fight. Does every kid who's aggressive have toxic stress or trauma? No, but it's something to think about and pay attention to. And aggression can be in words too. Speaking harshly, unkindly to other kids or teachers, using curse words or bad words. Irritability and anxiety, excessive temper tantrums. Temper tantrums, you know, I'm 3 years old and I wanted a blue crayon and you gave me a green one, I'm gonna have a tantrum and I'm very upset and I wanted that crayon. But this is, not that age appropriate. This is where it's excessive and it continues and it keeps going, and you feel like you can't transition activities. Maybe a child who you go into circle time and they don't want anything to do with it, and they're crying and they're rolling around, and then circle time and you finally get them to settle down right in time for it to be over, and then it's time to transition into another activity, and then it's that same reaction over and over again. So that inability to transition and settle into activities or look forward to them, that's a big red flag. Screaming and crying excessively, startling easily, loud noises, things that make a child have an exaggerated startle response. A poor appetite or an insatiable appetite. So a child who just really doesn't eat anything. We talked about that reaction in your body to stress, where it can affect your digestive system, your appetite. But also, I've worked with many traumatized kids that when I go into the classroom and I interview the teacher, I hear, just eats, such a great eater, can't stop eating, eats one plate and then another plate, and then we take the plate away and he's eating off other kids' plates, or just cries at the end of snack time because they can't stop eating. It could be an emotional void filling or a food insecurity. Fear of adults who remind them of a traumatic event. Now, we won't necessarily know this, but we might have a child who has 4 different caregivers who drop them off and pick them up, and one is an uncle and he randomly comes, and when he does, the child either, you see, freezes, doesn't act in their typical way, or cries and screams and refuses to go with them. Those could be some concerns. Sleep disturbance, falls asleep all morning, so tired, irritable. Mom says he never sleeps. That's something to think about. Difficulty focusing and learning. We talked about the lack of transition and the inability to change activities. The imitating abusive or traumatic events in play, big things to keep our eyes on, and just an extreme difficulty with concentrating. And I am aware that some of these things can be age appropriate in certain amounts, but this is something where you're making a note and thinking, this is just not right. So I'm going to do another video clip to kind of tie in the concepts we just talked about. And what I really like about this video is where it talks about the brain and it shows some MRI about children who have experienced toxic stress and who haven't, and the difference in brain development. This is a video that was developed by 0 to 3 for judges, actually, who work with young children who are exposed to toxic stress and trauma. So I'm going to show just a few minutes of it, and we can look a little bit into some of the brain development information.
Zero 3 is sponsoring this video to provide judges with the tools that will help them make better decisions about the lives of vulnerable infants and toddlers. The law is very old, but the science of early childhood development is relatively new. And it's important that we translate that science into practical knowledge and tools that judges can use in their everyday decision making.
We now have very powerful evidence from the explosion of research in neurobiology and the cracking of the human genome and the molecular biology revolution that we're living through right now. One thing that has taught us is that what goes on in the court when judges are deciding about the disposition of cases of children who've been abused and neglected,
this is for mental health,
is that they are literally holding the integrity of the child's brain development in their hands.
She attended one parenting class on May 27th and did not return. Made several other appointments. Okay, so I'm going to find the mother in noncompliance, which is a very serious thing. I'm Cindy Lederman. I'm the presiding judge of the juvenile court in Miami, Florida. The allegations related to physical abuse of the child, and I have a child named Trevon who now is almost 3, right? I would see little girls come in because they were abused or neglected and grow up, become 13 or 14 years old in the system, become pregnant. And the question was, my God, when is this going to end? And what will it take to intervene so that that new baby that I see that I'm now responsible for after having the grandmother and the mother in court, what can I do to make sure that new baby's children don't come into the system? The children who come to us have so little, and we need to give them so much so that they can make up for what has brought them into the system. The more I learn about the brain, the more I realize how crucial this work is, and how important this period of time in a baby's life is.
If we think of the brain as a massive collection of billions and billions of cells, it's the connections, the circuits among the cells that are really responsible for all the work that the brain does. Most of those circuits are developed early in life. And so literally the experiences that children have, the kind of world they live in, and particularly the relationships they have, literally shape and sculpt the architecture of their brain. And when the environment is not safe and protective, when it's violent, when it's unpredictable, when it is abusive, when it's very neglecting, it activates physiological systems that make your stress hormones level go up, particularly a stress hormone called cortisol. The cortisol level that goes up and stays up for days or months at a time literally poisons the circuits that are developing at that time in the brain. Whether it's the circuits for communication, whether it's the circuits for building trust in a relationship. You live with that disrupted circuit for the rest of your life.
One of the things children learn in the first year of life, particularly the second half of the first year of life, is to form an important relationship with at least one person, maybe more than one person. And for children who've been taken out of their home because they've been abused and neglected, put in one or more placements, they don't learn that. And so what you see is a growing inability to trust people.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying.
Okay. So taking a look at that model and the MRI images that we saw there, and just that the fact that part of the brain actually doesn't develop as a result of continuing to live in this kind of state. And it really puts in perspective for me the importance of that ability to create an environment where a child can come and have that feeling, have that ability to feel safe, feel connected, and start to learn. Let's talk a little bit about something that teachers have always wanted me to work with them on, is this concept of a trigger. What is a trigger? And we've all said, oh, that makes me feel triggered. I feel triggered. A trigger is something that has the result of arousing feelings or memories associated with a trauma experience. Children are not sophisticated enough to be aware of their triggers, but what we can do is start to kind of pay attention to maybe certain activities, sounds, areas, parts of the day where a child might, we notice, are triggered. When I worked in the classroom with teachers, I would, if we had a child who was particularly aggressive, or we had a lot of concerns about their behavior, one thing that we would do was kind of try to do a little tracking sheet. We would take a week and I would kind of give them a blank calendar with times, and we would just make a quick note. You know, Johnny, he's been very aggressive, and we would kind of make a quick note during the time of day when Johnny was aggressive and maybe what happened right before, so that we could try to kind of keep a list and maybe start to identify what some triggers might be. It could be a certain sound, a screechy sound, a crying sound of a child. It could be a certain smell. It could be a certain meal that we're serving. I don't know what happens. I can't be responsible for knowing what's going on with Johnny all the hours outside of my care of him. And he is not going to be able to tell me necessarily. My mommy and daddy fight all the time when it's dinner time, and I sit down and I don't like it. And when I smell chicken or when I smell this, I start to get upset. He's not going to be able to tell me that. But what's important for me to note is that I can see that Johnny gets very upset every time we sit down for lunch. And then I can start to incorporate ways of relaxation and calming down and changing maybe the way I have Johnny sitting down so that I can make this more productive and more relaxing for him and maybe eliminate and reduce some triggers. This is a quick diagram that I really like, and it makes you think about the importance of incorporating kind of relaxation, self-care, and calming exercises with children in the classroom while they are like this. Because what happens when someone is triggered like this? Are you going to be able to teach them anything? No, we've already talked about that. And are you going to get them to be able to learn self-regulation? No. What happens to you when you're like this and someone says, calm down? Do you calm down? No, I feel like we flip even further back. So the very important thing about coping strategies and about calming and about self-regulation is that it must be practiced throughout the day, periodically when we're like this. So just taking a look at this diagram and thinking about it for our kids, what happens? We encounter some kind of a trigger that brought up a stressful feeling, sensory experience for us, and we feel awful. We have two tracks. We either go with a negative coping strategy where we hit, we run out of the classroom, where we have a negative reaction, and we maybe feel better for a second. Oh, that screaming sound really triggered me and I ran out and now it's not there and I feel better, but I have to return to the classroom and the screaming happens again and I keep going through this cycle. Or we start to develop positive coping strategies where I learn my breathing and I find a soft, squishy area that I can go and calm down in the classroom where I can tolerate the sound and calm down, and then I can resume and feel better for a long time and I don't go right back into that cycle. So how do we recognize triggers? Like I said, we're not with these kids 24 hours a day outside. We don't live with them. How do we recognize things that might be triggering to kids in classrooms, and what do we do about them? Well, the first thing, the most important thing, which I know we all know and we all hear all the time, but when we're talking about kids with trauma and stress, establishing predictable routines will help them feel safe. And it might not be easy to do initially. But when a child who has a home that maybe is very chaotic and stressful, and there is no idea what's happening next or how dad's going to come home today, or if mom's going to be sober or not, or if my brother's going to hit me or not, if I don't have these kinds of things at home and we don't know where our next meal is, when I go to school and I know I walk in and I hang up my coat and I sit at the table and I eat breakfast, and then we hear a certain song and that song tells me that it's time to go on to circle time, there's a comfort in that they might not have, and it starts to get that brain to start to come down. So creating a safe classroom environment that is nurturing and predictable can already start to bring that down. And once time goes on and we start to see and feel that every day is the same and that I can expect this and my teacher's always going to be nice to me and my friends are always going to play with me and no one's going to hit me and people care about how I feel and I could get a hug if I'm sad and someone might sit next to me when I have trouble sleeping. When we start to get into that over and over and over again, what are we doing is continuing to bring this down and getting ready for learning in our classroom. So this is helping with self-regulation, incorporating breathing techniques and games throughout the day, blowing a balloon, blowing bubbles, smile and relax, having deep breaths, using effective strategies for guiding behaviors instead of yelling and screaming, which I'm used to, hearing what I'm supposed to be doing, labeling behaviors and not children. And like I talked about, some tracking for problem behaviors to maybe try to identify some triggers. These are some things that can really help get your classroom and get your children into this state, no matter what is going on outside. So let's talk a little bit more about where can we go to help find specific strategies to help these kids. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of places that you can go. Infant mental health has kind of been an explosion lately in the last several years, and early intervention. And people are really recognizing and understanding how important it is to help kids get into the proper brain state for learning. So I really like conscious discipline. I think many people know about it. It's very, very popular, and I'm sure people have had training on it. But it is great reminders. This is a point in my presentation where I usually kind of go to some YouTube links for Becky Bailey, but I know time is out, and I'm afraid I'll mess up my perfectly flowing strategy right here. So you can go ahead and look at on your own if you just Google Dr. Becky Bailey and YouTube. She's got great little links and suggestions. She has great trainings. I know I had a number of my staff during the pandemic signed up for, she was offering 90 days of free training for certain webinars and things that she had. And everyone had reported back to me that they were extremely helpful. She has a 3-series trauma series about working with young children in the classroom who are traumatized. And so I think this is a great resource. Some of her books, Managing Emotional Mayhem, Strategies for Self-Regulation is a really good one, and Building Resilient Classrooms with Conscious Discipline. She also has Easy to Love, Difficult to Discipline, which is another great resource that I've used before in classrooms with children. Dr. Harvey Karp is another one that's easy to follow, has some really nice soothing strategies, The Happiest Baby on the Block, The Happiest Toddler on the Block, talking about different ways to incorporate self-regulation, to talk to children at their level, to use specific language with children. I like some of these kind of resources because they just work. Talking to children, you're very angry, your face is frowny, you're stamping your feet, your fists are clenched. So using some of the physical language to help them identify that fight, flight, or freeze, what's going on in your body that says that you're very angry, giving them some physical cues. And these are things that we work on when they're not like this as well. What happens when you're angry? Your face gets frowny, your body gets tense, your fists get clenched. So helping them to recognize cues of when they're not feeling well or when they're not regulated, when they are regulated. So these are some good resources. I love the Brazelton Touch Points model, the Brazelton Institute. The website has so many good resources. The Touch Points training is great for educators and for, it's actually created by pediatrician, Dr. Barry Brazelton, but some great strategies for working with parents and incorporating them and helping them to talk about what's going on outside of the whole classroom, inside of the classroom. So he has some great approaches. And then adding some more resources, the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, some videos that I showed you today, has some great stuff. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, there's their website with detailed information on evidence-based treatment for trauma, training, education, research, policy. 0 to 3, that's a great one where you can get so many articles and trainings. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has trainings that you can take. I think that it's up to us to kind of reach out and find some resources and some ways that we can incorporate some of this stuff into our classroom. The most important thing to think about is that idea that we might, when we return to in-person learning, be having kids who've been spending a lot of time in this kind of brain model, and what we need to be conscious of and what we need to incorporate into our work to help create a classroom of kids that are here and ready to learn and to work with us. So I know that was a lot, and I'm going to go ahead and pause on my time and see if maybe we have time for a few questions or.
Yeah, I think that was amazing. And I wouldn't be the only one saying very powerful. I had to turn my screen off several times, not just because I want you to have the screen, but because it was very difficult to process, but still very impactful. We do have a few questions in the chat. The first one is specific to your conversation about complex trauma, acute trauma. It is from Sandy Basiglia, and she says, is the pandemic with prolonged human challenging experience related to complex trauma or not necessarily?
I think that it depends on what's happening for you during the pandemic in your home. How are you being explained what's going on? So if I'm a child and I'm quarantined at home, what is the environment like? Because complex trauma would be where I am in an unsafe environment. It is unpredictable. And now the pandemic is going to further impact that because I have no escape. I have no break. If it's my parents or someone in my home that's causing problems and they're not leaving to go to work or leaving to go places, then that has increased my experience of complex trauma or toxic stress. I don't have breaks where I get to go out and spend time on the playground and get a relief. I don't have breaks where I get to go to school and have a good experience away from the stress of home. So I think if you're in a situation of complex trauma, the pandemic has intensified it, absolutely. And I can speak from our practice and from what I'm seeing in the homes and what my staff are seeing in the homes, that it has definitely become a much bigger crisis for some families. And that's where, I think it's really important to think about the things that we've talked about and just to be aware when children are coming back that they, although they might be excited to come back to school, what has been going on while they were gone. So I think that's a good question. And it is definitely an area of toxic stress going on as well. And those that maybe don't understand what's going on and are scared of the coronavirus and maybe haven't had anyone talk to them about this, that could be coming in as a very scary thing for some children.
And then I guess leading straight into that response, what types of things would you recommend that we do to help children who are experiencing some of this type of stress during the pandemic? Or how would you engage them, in remote learning, knowing that they may be experiencing this complex trauma?
That's a great question. And I think we talked about the fact that, yes, if you have a kid coming on who's like this, any kind of, let's talk about the colors, let's find red, like this is not a state where I'm going to be really focused and ready. So whatever you can think about incorporating to start to get that relaxation maybe in. And I think some of the resources that I provided, like Conscious Discipline, Becky Bailey, if you start to look in, maybe you begin your session with breathing exercises. Maybe you begin the session with, let's pretend that we have a balloon and everybody, let's take our balloon and let's blow our balloon and get it bigger and bigger and bigger. Trying to find ways that we can kind of break some tension, incorporate breathing, and start to learn it as maybe a daily activity so that when we need it, it's there in our brain. When we're like this, we can only reflect on things we know. So if I'm very, very stressed out, I'm not going to learn new coping strategies at that moment. But if I have been practicing meditation as an adult and I'm super stressed out, I can go back into my brain and find some of those meditations and use them. And that kind of goes with children too. If we're working with them on breathing as a part of our everyday activities, we use sometimes lotions, having like a certain smelling lotion like lavender or Johnson's Baby that smells good. And hey, it's time for our lotion. Let's have lotion time. Let's breathe it in. We're doing deep breathing. How much lotion can you smell in your nose? Get all of it in there. So doing things that we're kind of incorporating this into our education so that we can reflect on it if we see, oh, it looks like Johnny is, his face is frowny and he's getting upset. I wonder what happens if we use our nose and we smell that lotion. So we have to reflect on things that we've been practicing every day, I would say.
And activating your senses, I think that's so important because it's another modality, it's another connection. We hope that in the future that scent alone, will become a way to manage and help cope with stress because it's been paired so many times with the breathing and it's been so helpful. Thank you so much. So in the chat box, we've been seeing lots of questions about the resources that you've been referencing and offering. And I just wanted to remind everyone that this presentation in PDF format is available in the Live Binder. So when you go to the Live Binder and you click on track 2, you're going to see both of slides for both the presentations, the one we saw earlier with Dr. Espinosa and the one that we're finishing up right now with Melissa. And you'll be able to open up the presentations, go through the slides, and also see the links to resources. So you'll be able to see it there. I don't know if we have any additional questions that we haven't answered just yet? Oh, there's a question that came up on the Q&A from Ms. Gladys Montes. What resources may you point us to so that directors can help teachers who've suffered from trauma? So we've talked a lot about supporting our students who are dealing with trauma. What would we do to really support our teachers who maybe have their own trauma that they're working with or maybe intensified as a result of the pandemic?
And I think that's a good point, because we also, we're all human, and we might even have certain kids or certain behaviors in the classroom that trigger us a little bit. So I think if there's time and space for meetings, for support in the classroom, for maybe even supervision periods with teachers where we can reflect and talk. I think a very important thing is if you have, and I know when I worked in the classroom, I would have meetings with teachers where we were able to sit and reflect and talk about children that were particularly difficult and stressful, and kind of come up with individual plans for them, and give the teachers the opportunity to speak about what it feels like to be in the classroom all day with a child who may be biting or hitting, or, I can sit here and talk intellectually with you about all of this, but when you go in the classroom and it's, someone's coming at you to bite you or hit you every day, it can be tough and it can be hard, and this stuff can kind of escape our brain, and we need that moment to be able to kind of vent a little bit and then reflect and think, what might be going on for this kid, and having that space to plan, to be able to do some behavioral tracking, and to have a little bit of supervision and moments for the teachers where maybe at lunchtime they get together with a social worker or with a director and be able to talk a little bit about what they're seeing, what's going on, and how they kind of feel about it, so that there's a little bit of a relief for them as well. And let me tell you, as an adult, even when you're facing a child that you don't know what to do with and you're stressed, if the first thing you do is take a breath yourself, you kind of get your own self-regulation, and you're modeling it for them. So if you're screaming and yelling at me and I say, Johnny, your face is red, your hands are fun, you're so angry, let's take a breath. I'm going to take a breath right now. And I take my breath, then I've kind of prepared myself and modeled for the child too what we want them to start doing.
It was going to happen eventually. I was going to start talking and I'd be muted.
Right.
Thank you so much. I'm really just really excited to be a part of this, and I see in the chat box a lot of our participants are as well. This has been a great conversation. Both sessions have been a great source of information and support, and really loved being able to kind of ask you those questions.